Organizations do not collapse overnight.
Right.
They just don't shatter without warning. They fail because of a procedural shortcut here, a misunderstood directive there.
Exactly. It's systemic.
You see a unit miss its mission target, and, you instinctively blame the personnel on the ground. You blame the people.
Because that's the easy target.
But today, we are going to look deeper. We are looking at the invisible machinery, the systemic architecture that guarantees failure before a single individual even clocks in.
The underlying logic.
Welcome to the Blue Suit Files. Today, we execute a forensic analysis of Air Force Handbook 1, specifically Chapter 13, Developing Organizations.
And the objective of this deep dive is incredibly precise.
We are targeting the required comprehension level for a technical sergeant, which the doctrine designates as Level B.
Right. Level B dictates understanding.
We are not here to memorize dates. We are not here to recite acronyms like a dictionary.
No, absolutely not.
We are here to decode the mechanical relationships between strategic thinking, organizational structure, and problem-solving methodologies. Okay, let's unpack this.
The stakes here are absolute. You really must view an organization as an industrial machine.
A machine that can break.
Exactly. And if you operate within this machine and you do not understand the underlying logic driving its gears, you cease to be an asset. You actually become a structural liability.
Because Level B comprehension requires you to grasp the operational philosophy, the philosophy that prevents the system from cannibalizing itself.
Yes. We are examining the invisible architecture that dictates exactly why regulations exist. And look, the inevitable, measurable fallout when those regulations are ignored.
So we are not looking at what the rules are.
No, we are analyzing the consequences of breaking the underlying logic of the system.
Right. So we begin with the analytical reasoning behind strategic thinking. There is this persistent operational myth at the tactical level.
The myth that strategic thinking is an activity reserved exclusively for senior leadership.
Exactly. That looking at the big picture is somehow above your pay grade.
Right, that your only job is to execute the task directly in front of you.
But the doctrine explicitly dispels this. Strategic thinking is the required mechanical linkage to align the lowest echelon of the organization with the highest strategic target.
It is not an abstract academic concept.
No, it's an operational requirement for establishing goals and planning execution within any unit, regardless of scale.
And the doctrine provides empirical data regarding this requirement, actually.
The survey data, right?
Right. When retired United States Air Force general officers were surveyed regarding the personnel who most excelled at strategic thinking, a hard consensus emerged from the data.
What was the first trait?
Well, these individuals demonstrated 4 distinct analytical capabilities. First, they possessed the ability to identify both the best case and worst case scenarios for how a specific situation might resolve.
So they didn't operate on blind optimism.
Never. They never assumed a plan would survive first contact with reality intact. They mapped out the extreme parameters of success and failure.
That makes sense. What was the second capability?
Second, they systematically considered how proposed courses of action would affect all other stakeholders.
Meaning they understood that changing a variable in their department would inevitably create friction or a cascading effect in another.
Precisely. You can't operate in a vacuum.
Which brings us to the third capability, which the doctrine refers to as working your boss's problems.
Yes, a critical metric of systemic alignment.
If you are solving tactical problems in a vacuum, you risk creating operational friction for the echelon above you.
Because a strategic thinking mindset ensures priorities and objectives are synchronized up the chain of command.
Right. If your localized solution creates a bottleneck for the squadron commander, you haven't solved the problem. You have simply relocated it.
Exactly. And the fourth capability demonstrated by these exceptional planners was the ability to identify realistic time horizons for goal achievement.
Their operational tempo.
Right. It was defined by a specific mandate. They thought big, they started small, and they scaled fast.
They understood that attempting a massive enterprise-wide change without a localized proof of concept is just a recipe for catastrophic failure.
They mapped out the timeline required for adaptation rather than enforcing arbitrary deadlines disconnected from reality.
So when current performance fails to meet the target, continuous improvement methods must be deployed.
Right, to correct the trajectory.
But before we can even analyze those methods, we must deconstruct the 3 fundamental pillars of the strategic mindset.
Because if you lack these three pillars, your methodology will collapse regardless of how perfectly you follow a checklist.
Right. Pillar one is intellectual flexibility.
The doctrine defines this as a willingness to adjust one's understanding, opinions, or approach when conditions change.
Or when new information is presented. But I must pose a pushback question regarding operational risk here. There is a systemic contradiction. I mean, if the military demands absolute compliance to technical orders and standardized regulations, how does it simultaneously demand intellectual flexibility?
It sounds like a paradox.
Right. Isn't flexibility just another word for compromising standards when the pressure gets too high?
That is a common and dangerous misinterpretation that leads directly to operational paralysis.
So how does the doctrine clarify this jargon?
It clarifies it explicitly. Intellectual flexibility is about bending, not breaking.
Bending, not breaking.
Right. It requires adjusting tactical execution without abandoning the long-term strategic objective or the required standard of safety.
Consider a practical scenario provided by the text.
The training budget scenario.
Exactly. Imagine a request for members of your unit to receive critical, required training is denied due to unavoidable budgetary constraints.
A rigid, purely mechanistic response is to simply ignore the training requirement entirely.
And just let the unit's readiness degrade.
Or to repeatedly submit the same doomed funding request, waiting for a different answer that will never come.
Both responses guarantee mission failure.
Because the individual has allowed an administrative roadblock to defeat the strategic objective.
Precisely. Intellectual flexibility demands a systemic workaround. You assess the available resources.
You send one single member of your team to receive the training using whatever localized funds you can secure.
And then that member returns, operationalizes the knowledge, and trains the rest of the unit.
Right. Alternatively, you identify a neighboring unit on your installation that already possesses the requisite training.
And you utilize their personnel to instruct your team.
The foundational standard is maintained. The strategic goal of a fully trained force is achieved.
The method of execution simply adapted to the reality of the resource constraints. You bent the administrative pathway to protect the unbending operational standard.
Which is brilliant system logic.
That transition leads directly into the second pillar of the strategic mindset, intellectual inclusiveness.
This requires actively welcoming information and opinions from a broad range of sources.
The system cannot afford to exist within echo chambers. The text mandates looking beyond your immediate organization.
This means utilizing both formal and informal networks.
Right. The text explicitly suggests reaching out to peers from past assignments.
Or maintaining contacts within other branches of the armed services.
Because if you restrict your data collection to your immediate surroundings, you are virtually guaranteeing systemic blindness.
You will fall victim to groupthink, where everyone in your unit agrees on a flawed course of action.
Simply because no one possesses the external perspective required to see the flaw.
Which leads directly to the third, and perhaps most critical, pillar: intellectual humility.
This is the absolute necessity of assuming your own understanding is flawed.
It requires a high comfort level with being wrong.
Or at least possessing an incomplete picture of the operational reality.
You must possess the psychological tendency to continuously check yourself, examining issues as if your foundational understanding is incorrect in some fundamental way.
Think of it like a pilot relying on navigation instruments.
That's a perfect analogy.
If the pilot operates without intellectual humility, they trust their innate sense of direction over the hard data the instruments are providing.
And when spatial disorientation sets in,
They fly the aircraft directly into the ground because they refuse to believe their own internal gyroscope was flawed.
without intellectual humility, a leader will blindly march an organization toward catastrophic oversight.
Actively rejecting valid, life-saving data simply because it contradicts their preconceived assumptions.
With that mindset established, the doctrine shifts to the physical execution of these principles.
Right. Strategic thinking in action consists of 4 distinct sequential activities.
Scanning, questioning, conceptualizing, and testing.
Scanning is the continuous identification of emerging patterns in your operational environment.
It involves taking in, deconstructing, and synthesizing information from diverse, seemingly unrelated sources.
To apply it to future operations. And this can involve convening expert panels.
Or conducting a deep dive analysis of historical maintenance data to identify long-term degradation trends before a system physically fails.
Questioning is the next mechanism, used to understand an issue from multiple perspectives.
You must frame issues broadly. You have to explore the entire anatomy of a problem rather than rushing to an immediate superficial solution.
You must demand input from all stakeholders. Then comes conceptualizing.
Right, this identifies the future direction through brainstorming and analytic tools.
The key here is intentionally deferring the rejection of options until a thorough exploration is complete.
Because if you shoot down an idea in the first 5 minutes of conceptualizing, you shut down the creative machinery of your team.
Finally, we reach testing. Testing allows for informed speculation.
Testing is a vital risk mitigation protocol. The text provides the example of role-playing how a proposed course of action will be communicated to external stakeholders.
And systematically predicting their responses.
Furthermore, the proposed solution must be tested on a small, controllable scale. This is referred to as a pilot test.
Implementing an untested, unverified solution across an entire enterprise is a recipe for widespread operational failure.
A pilot test allows leaders to evaluate the initial impact, measure the secondary effects, and address structural flaws before mass implementation inflicts damage on the broader system.
But execution requires precise targeting. Goal setting is the mechanism, but the doctrine is specific. You cannot just tell people to do better.
No, goals must adhere to the SMART framework to effectively and measurably improve performance.
Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Let's break those down.
Specific objectives answer the who, what, where, when, the constraints, and the foundational purpose, the why.
Measurable requires established, objective criteria to track progress until the objective is secured. I mean, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it.
Attainable mandates that applicable resources are available and tasks are physically possible within acceptable risk parameters.
But here I must acknowledge a critical nuance in the text.
Regarding attainability.
Yes. The text states that attainable does not imply easy. In fact, research proves that challenging goals improve performance significantly more than setting goals that are easy or moderately difficult.
That's a vital distinction. Relevant links the goal back to the broader mission and vision.
And time-bound provides the hard completion date, ensuring periodic and overall accountability.
The application of goal setting requires a deep understanding of human incentive structures.
This is where we get into the psychology of the system.
Exactly. The doctrine distinguishes between egocentric goals and group-centric goals.
This distinction literally dictates whether an organizational system thrives or whether it destroys itself from within.
Interdependent work that requires reliance on others demands group-centric goals.
Right, because egocentric goals focus strictly on maximizing individual results.
When collaboration is necessary, egocentric goals backfire catastrophically.
Let's ground this theory in reality. The text provides a chilling example of this systemic breakdown.
The communications help desk environment.
Consider a communications help desk. Management decides to improve efficiency by implementing an egocentric goal,
requiring each individual technician to resolve a specific high number of tickets per month.
And their performance report is tied exclusively to this individual metric.
The predictable human response is to immediately begin hoarding easy tickets.
Because this metric actively disincentivizes any support to the wider team.
A highly skilled technician will flatly refuse to train or coach new team members.
Because any time spent training a junior airman is time lost on their own individual ticket resolution.
The organization's overall performance plummets, wait times skyrocket, and complex problems are ignored.
Because the incentive structure encourages internal sabotage. The leadership built a machine designed to fail.
Precisely. The underlying logic of the system is flawed. The alternative is the group-centric goal,
where the target is set for the entire work unit to resolve a certain number of tickets,
or to bring the average resolution time down collectively.
This structure inherently incentivizes both the individual processing of tickets and the active support necessary to elevate the performance of the entire team.
A senior technician is now incentivized to teach a junior technician how to clear a queue faster.
Because the senior technician's success is mathematically tied to the junior technician's output, the goal aligns the individual's self-interest with the system's survival.
It's beautiful system logic when applied correctly.
But having a flawless strategic mindset is entirely useless if the physical architecture of your unit fights against it.
This brings us to the friction point between human logic and organizational structure.
Execution requires infrastructure. A strategic mindset is a hallucination without the physical and procedural reality to support it.
To systematically alter an organization, the doctrine states that 5 interrelated fronts must be synchronized simultaneously.
Organization and people. Technology, policies, legislation, and regulations. Physical infrastructure. and process.
Human resources require the actual knowledge, skills, and tools to execute.
Technology must be leveraged to eliminate barriers between customers and suppliers, compressing both time cycles and physical distance.
Policies must be actively rewritten to support new processes. You cannot run a modern process bound by outdated regulations.
Physical facilities and equipment must be positioned to maximize workflow.
And the process itself, the actual flow of the work, must be continuously redesigned.
The Department of Defense utilizes a highly specific thought process to generate these informed, conclusive solutions.
It ensures that planners consider a broad spectrum of requirements before undertaking any new operational effort.
This is the DOTMLPF framework: doctrine, organization, training material, leadership and education, personnel, and facilities.
Right.
Looking at DOTMLPF, it's easy to treat it like just another military acronym, but it is actually an interlocking web of dependencies. I need a concrete explanation of how these letters interact.
Let's analyze the causality. Doctrine dictates the way we fight.
It establishes the operational philosophy, such as a shift toward decentralized, drone-heavy warfare.
Organization dictates how we structure the personnel to execute that fight.
Perhaps moving from massive air wings to smaller, agile task forces.
Training dictates how we prepare to fight tactically, shifting the curriculum to unmanned aerial systems.
Material is a highly specific clinical term we must define.
Material is the physical equipment necessary to sustain the force.
This means the actual drones, the weapons payloads, the proprietary software, and the spare parts. It does not merely mean administrative materials like paper and pens.
Exactly. Leadership and education dictate the professional development required to prepare commanders to lead this new type of warfare.
Personnel dictates the availability of qualified individuals. Do we have enough sensor operators?
And finally, facilities dictates the real property, the installations, and the physical infrastructure required to support the force.
So if you change the doctrine to require drone-heavy warfare, but you ignore the F facilities,
The whole thing falls apart.
meaning you don't build the specialized hangars with the required fiber optic infrastructure and server cooling capacity at your forward operating bases, your doctrine is utterly meaningless.
The drones overheat on the tarmac.
Your highly trained personnel have no functional workspace. The millions spent on material are wasted.
If a commander ignores even one letter of the DOTMLPF framework, the proposed solution contains a fatal structural vulnerability,
The letters are interdependent gears. If one stops turning, the machine shreds itself.
which requires us to analyze how these organizations are physically built to handle that machinery.
The core tension in any structural design is balancing the need for absolute precision with the need for operational flexibility.
Precision decreases ambiguity. It maintains strict order and ensures directives are followed without deviation.
Flexibility allows for rapid adaptation to new threats and encourages structural innovation.
The doctrine mandates that organizational design must be determined by the mission, the strategy, the environment, the size of the unit, and the pace of technology.
There are 4 distinct structures we must analyze: the mechanistic structure, the organic structure, the diverse structure, and the matrix structure.
Let's dissect the mechanistic or bureaucratic structure.
This is vertically arranged. Communication and decision-making originate at the absolute apex of the hierarchy and filter strictly downward.
Low-level members have virtually zero involvement in decision-making.
Employees operate in highly specialized teams with a heavy reliance on strict, unbending rules.
This system logic is engineered for one thing: high efficiency in a stable environment.
Tasks are accomplished quickly, uniformly, and accurately, but there is a severe systemic consequence to this rigidity.
The measurable fallout of a purely mechanistic structure is critically low job satisfaction.
Because subordinates merely comply with orders. They offer no contribution to the operational methodology.
When the environment changes or a new variable is introduced, a mechanistic structure cannot adapt because the personnel at the bottom are not authorized to think.
They're only authorized to execute.
The inverse of this is the organic structure.
It features both horizontal and vertical communication. The rigid bureaucratic lines are erased.
Crosstalk across departments is mandated. Employees are heavily involved in decision-making.
This flexibility facilitates rapid technological advancement and creative problem-solving.
The environment is assumed to be unstable, with change functioning as the baseline norm.
The commercial software industry operates almost entirely on this logic. It generates high worker satisfaction and well-rounded, thoroughly debated decisions.
But what is the operational reality of applying this to a military environment?
Right. If everyone is talking, debating, and there are no rigid bureaucratic lines, what happens to the mission when lives are on the line?
The operational fallout of a purely organic structure in a high-stakes military context is significant and often fatal.
The doctrine explicitly warns that an organic structure drastically slows down the implementation process.
It leads to low overall efficiency because consensus takes time.
Most critically, the text states an organic structure reduces standards. We must clarify this vagueness.
What does reduces standards actually mean in this context?
It means that the absence of rigid compliance mechanisms allows localized deviations from protocol to become normalized.
If you are operating a munitions flight, loading live ordnance onto an aircraft, you require absolute unthinking precision.
If you apply an organic structure to a munitions flight, allowing airmen to creatively interpret the loading manual to save time, you will inevitably blow up the flight line.
If you require absolute precision, an organic structure will fail you.
Recognizing the fatal flaws in both extremes, the doctrine presents the diverse structure.
This is a hybrid logic. It incorporates both mechanistic and organic designs within the exact same organizational entity.
The text provides the example of an administrative section processing performance reports or deployment orders.
This requires strict, uniform rules. A mechanistic system is implemented here to prevent errors.
Conversely, the training section within that same unit requires rapid innovation to keep up with emerging adversary tactics.
A rigid mechanistic system would hinder the delivery of new training, so an organic system is applied there.
You apply the structure that fits the specific submission.
The final structure is the matrix structure. This is a temporary architectural design nested within a broader organization.
It is engineered to address a specific short-lived need by pooling specialized expertise and resources from entirely different sections.
The defining characteristic of a matrix structure is dual authority. An employee in a matrix structure literally has two bosses.
The functional boss manages their administrative duties, their performance reports, and their normal working hours.
And the project boss directs the specific temporary task at hand.
Think of a matrix structure like a specialized task force in a spy movie.
Right.
You have an intelligence analyst who belongs to the CIA, that's their functional boss, who handles their pay and their annual reviews.
But for this specific 6-month mission, they are assigned to report to a joint task force military commander, the project boss.
The vulnerability in this logic is obvious. The doctrine states the primary weakness is confusion of who is in charge.
Meaning, overlapping authority can completely stall execution.
If the CIA functional boss says stand down and return to headquarters for a mandatory briefing, and the task force project boss says engage the target immediately, the analyst is paralyzed.
The conflicting directives cause the system to bog down.
Exactly. And navigating that friction requires an understanding of how changes are actually implemented within these structures.
Change is not an organic, spontaneous occurrence.
It is the deliberate adoption of a new idea or behavior and the systematic establishment of new operational norms.
Before a physical process can change, leadership must prepare the psychological climate of the organization.
The text mandates that leaders must clearly explain the shortfalls of the present process and mathematically demonstrate the benefits of the proposed change.
If you don't do this, the system rejects the change,
which inevitably triggers human resistance. The doctrine outlines the anatomy of resistance.
It categorizes 5 predictable human failures or psychological responses to organizational change.
Distrust, uncertainty, self-interest, different perception, and overdetermination.
Distrust occurs when an imposed change affects an organization, and leadership is unprepared or unwilling to clarify the underlying thought process.
Employee doubt calcifies into active, hostile resistance.
Uncertainty triggers a primal fear of the unknown. Employees question their job security, their relevance, and their cognitive ability to learn new technological systems.
Self-interest causes individuals to question how the change impacts their personal power, their budget, and their position within the hierarchy.
Different perception means employees simply do not see the need for change, particularly if the problem was identified at the strategic level and dropped on them without prior communication.
The fifth response is critical for a level B comprehension. Overdetermination. We must translate this jargon.
The text uses the term overdetermination, meaning a mechanistic structure so rigid it acts as a literal barrier, legally or procedurally, to necessary change.
The structure itself inhibits adaptation.
Overdetermination is what happens when the rulebook becomes more important than the mission itself.
It's when you know a physical process is broken, You know it is costing the unit thousands of man-hours, but you cannot fix it because a specific regulation dictates that you have to route a paper form through 3 different administrative offices just to get authorization to change the process.
The system's obsession with compliance is literally preventing its own survival.
To counter this resistance, the doctrine provides 5 distinct approaches.
Education and communication to systematically reduce uncertainty by providing hard data.
Participation and involvement to generate psychological ownership of the new process among the staff.
Facilitation and support, such as the gradual introduction of new software combined with additional dedicated training hours.
Negotiation and agreement, which involves offering administrative incentives to resistors to secure their compliance. And finally, coercion.
Coercion is listed as a method, but the clinical data within the doctrine strictly discourages its use.
Coercion is a forcing technique. You leverage your rank to mandate compliance under threat of punishment.
The consequence of this is long-term organizational sabotage.
Coerced compliance negatively affects attitudes, but more crucially, it requires constant, exhausting leadership oversight.
The moment the leader looks away, the coerced employee reverts to the old system.
Or worse, if you coerce an organization into a new process, the personnel will often weaponize malicious compliance.
They will follow the new directive so rigidly and literalistically that the system intentionally grinds to a halt.
Simply to prove to leadership that the new process is flawed. That is the true operational cost of coercion. It is a highly inefficient use of leadership capital.
To avoid the trap of coercion, the doctrine relies heavily on Kurt Lewin's 3-stage change process.
Stage 1, unfreezing. Stage 2, changing. Stage 3, refreezing. Let's look at stage 1, unfreezing.
This is a deliberate, calculated management activity.
It creates a psychological environment where people genuinely feel a need for change.
You must point out the existing problems, highlight the data showing the failures, and generate a felt need in the personnel who will be most affected.
You cannot bend cold steel without shattering it. You have to apply heat, alter its atomic structure, shape it, and then let it cool.
Organizations are exactly the same. Unfreezing is applying the heat of necessity.
The consequence of failing to properly execute the unfreezing stage is absolute systemic rejection.
If you attempt to alter the physical or structural reality before unfreezing the human element, the organization rejects the new process like a biological virus.
The system attacks the new protocol because it does not recognize the necessity of its existence.
Stage 2 is changing. This is the actual modification of the technology, the tasks, the structure, or the distribution of people.
You are physically altering the accepted status quo. The text highlights a crucial warning during this vulnerable phase.
Signs of implementing change too early include intensely negative employee reactions and technological systems bogging down because the infrastructure wasn't completely ready.
The change agent must intensely monitor the people most affected, adjusting the flow of implementation based on real-time feedback.
Stage 3 is refreezing. You have shaped the steel. Now you must lock in the new atomic structure to make it permanent.
The doctrine mandates actively encouraging and reinforcing the new techniques.
Without deliberate reward systems, human nature defaults back to the path of least resistance, the old habits.
Positively reinforcing desired outcomes through public recognition or performance reports freezes the new behaviors into place, establishing the new baseline norm.
This brings us to continuous improvement methodologies.
The text lists 4 major methodologies utilized by the military to optimize systems, but they are often conflated.
Looking at Lean versus Six Sigma, it's easy to think they both just mean doing things faster.
But they target fundamentally different mechanical failures. Lean, Six Sigma, business process reengineering, theory of constraints. Let's delineate these.
Lean is about cutting out the garbage steps entirely, right?
Exactly. Lean is focused entirely on workflow and maximizing customer value.
Its primary mechanism is the systematic identification and elimination of non-value-added activities, colloquially known as waste.
If a process requires an airman to walk across a hangar 10 times a day to retrieve a tool, Lean dictates that you move the tool crib closer. You eliminate the wasted motion.
Six Sigma is a fundamentally different, highly rigorous, data-driven methodology.
It minimizes waste by identifying, controlling, and reducing process variation.
Lean removes the unnecessary steps. Six Sigma ensures that the remaining necessary steps are performed identically, with near-zero defects every single time.
It relies on intense statistical analysis.
Then we have business process reengineering, or BPR.
This is not about tweaking a process. BPR is a fundamental, radical redesign.
It is a comprehensive overhaul of how business processes are performed.
You burn the old process down to the foundation and rebuild it from scratch to implement agile, innovative ideas.
You don't try to make a horse-drawn carriage faster. You invent the combustion engine.
Finally, there is the theory of constraints. This is a systematic approach focused purely on bottlenecks.
You optimize resource utilization by identifying the single weakest link in a process, exploiting it to its maximum capacity, subordinating every other step to match that bottleneck's pace, elevating the bottleneck by adding resources, and then reassessing the process to find the next constraint.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Here is where the architecture of this doctrine truly connects.
We must synthesize these disparate concepts.
How does a leader take a strategic mindset, apply the correct organizational structure, navigate human resistance, and execute a continuous improvement methodology?
The Department of Defense standardizes this synthesis through an 8-step framework, the practical problem-solving method.
This is the operational engine of continuous improvement. Let's run a complex operational failure through this exact 8-step engine to see how the system logic holds up.
Imagine a logistics squadron is experiencing a massive 20% spike in vehicle maintenance delays.
Sorties are being missed because refueling trucks are constantly broken down.
Step 1. Clarify and validate the problem. You do not rely on anecdotal complaints from the flight line.
You must develop a precise problem statement using hard, verifiable data to identify the who, what, when, where, and the systemic significance of the delays.
The text provides a massive warning here that ruins most investigations before they begin.
A problem statement must never assume a root cause, a solution, or a countermeasure.
If your step 1 statement is, "We need more mechanics because the trucks are breaking down," you have assumed the cause and corrupted the entire analytical process.
Step 2. Break down the problem and identify performance gaps. You measure the mathematical gap between the current state, a 20% delay rate, and the expected outcome, which is a 5% baseline delay rate.
This frames the exact dimensions of the problem identified in step 1.
Step 3. Set improvement targets. These targets must be based on broader strategic goals. They must be challenging but achievable.
You state, reduce vehicle maintenance delays from 20% to 8% within 90 days.
Step 4. Determine root cause. The doctrine notes that organizations constantly hemorrhage resources solving the exact same problems repeatedly because they target superficial symptoms rather than the root cause.
If you buy new tires for the trucks because they're wearing out too fast, you are treating a symptom.
You must dig deep, perhaps using the 5 whys technique, and validate the root cause using the hard data collected in step 1.
You discover the root cause isn't bad tires, and it isn't a lack of mechanics. The root cause is a newly implemented, highly corrosive de-icing fluid being used on the flight line that is degrading the undercarriage of the specific refueling vehicles.
Step 5. Develop countermeasures. Brainstorming occurs here. You must defer judgment to let ideas flow, perhaps finding an alternative de-icing fluid or applying a protective sealant to the undercarriages.
But strategic alignment is paramount. You must obtain a vector check with leadership to ensure the proposed solution aligns with the budget and environmental regulations.
The doctrine provides a mathematical truth regarding implementation here.
The actual impact of a solution equals the quality of the solution multiplied by the acceptance of the people implementing it.
If you mandate a highly effective sealant, but the application process is so toxic and time-consuming that the mechanics refuse to use it properly, worker acceptance is 0.
Therefore, the impact is 0.
Step 6. See countermeasures through. You execute the plan. You track detailed implementation timelines meticulously.
Step 7. Confirm results in process. After 90 days, you compare the hard data of the newly implemented countermeasures against the performance gaps identified in Step 2.
Did the delay rate drop from 20% to 8%?
If the targets are not met, the system dictates you must return to Step 4, as an incorrect root cause determination is statistically the most common error in this process.
And we arrive at Step 8. Standardize successful processes. The doctrine explicitly states this is the most commonly neglected step in the entire problem-solving method.
Let's say your protective sealant works perfectly. Delays drop to 4%. You celebrate.
But if you fail to submit a formal change request to update the technical orders, or if you fail to communicate this operational victory to other logistics squadrons across the Air Force, your victory is completely localized.
When you transfer to a new base, the new mechanics won't know about the sealant. The delay rate will spike again.
Your solution was ultimately useless to the wider system.
Which brings us to the administrative reality of executing these solutions. Section 13.15 introduces project management.
We need to strictly clarify the jargon here. What is the operational distinction between a project and a program?
The distinction is entirely temporal. Programs are ongoing, indefinite operations with no distinct end date.
Managing the daily operations of a dining facility is a program.
Projects are temporary endeavors. They possess an established, singular objective and a highly specific time frame for completion.
Upgrading the kitchen equipment in that dining facility by a specific date is a project.
Project management is bound by the iron triangle of constraints. The text identifies the primary constraints as quality, time, and cost.
Cost encompasses money, manpower, machinery, and materials.
This is the unforgiving logic of project management.
The doctrine states that one of these constraints will always be the primary driver. You can only prioritize one, and it will strictly dictate the mathematical reality of the other two.
The laws of project management do not bend to enthusiasm.
If time is your primary driver and leadership moves the deadline up by 3 weeks, you cannot maintain the same parameters.
Cost must exponentially increase by paying overtime or rushing shipping, or quality must significantly decrease.
To navigate these unforgiving constraints, planners rely on architectural tools.
The primary tool is the work breakdown structure, or WBS.
The WBS systematically divides a massive project into smaller, manageable subunits or work packages.
By breaking the project into visual levels of detail, the WBS structurally prevents the omission of essential steps.
It ensures you don't start building the walls before you've poured the foundation.
The second tool is task analysis. This is far more granular than the WBS.
It details specific task milestones, exactly how those milestones will be measured for success, and the required resources for each microstep.
It provides the sequencing necessary to interrelate tasks and ensure operational efficiency without bottlenecking.
So what does this all mean? We have reached the conclusion of our Level B comprehension analysis.
To survive, operate, and lead effectively within this structural machinery, you cannot merely memorize a list of frameworks or recite definitions from a handbook.
You must deeply understand the causality and the relationships between these concepts.
The clinical conclusion is this: strategic goals will always fail without structural alignment.
Your organizational structure will eventually fail without the rigorous application of continuous improvement methodologies.
And your continuous improvement efforts will inevitably fail if compliance is coerced rather than systematically unfrozen, changed, and refrozen into the culture.
The machine only functions when the underlying logic is understood at every single echelon.
You are not just a cog in the machine. If you understand the mechanics, you become the architect of the machine's survival.
We leave you with a final, chilling, systemic question to mull over.
If the doctrine explicitly identifies Step 8, standardizing the successful process, as the most neglected step in problem solving,
How many millions of hours of efficiency, how many critical resources, and how much operational readiness is being lost in your organization right now simply because a localized tactical victory was allowed to die in a vacuum?
think about the workarounds your unit uses every day that aren't in the official manual.
That is unstandardized success, and it is costing the system everything. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.